About ready?
Yeah, we'll get started. Good morning. The Lord be with you. So this week we kick off our Justice Ministry series on immigration. I'm David West, part of the Justice Ministry team here, and glad you are here. John and I were talking. If you're like me, you start thinking about immigration, and after a while, your head hurts, your heart hurts. It's just hard to know in our polarized media world, like what is truth, what really is happening. How should I feel about this? How should I think about it? And it seems it's very advantageous for the media and for political leaders to try to make immigration kind of all about one thing. It's this thing or it's that thing, and where clearly it is such a complex and nuanced conversation. So the goal for this series is to equip us as a community to think more deeply and take a more nuanced approach to issues around immigration. So this week we're talking about history and policy. Next week we'll be talking about theological issues around immigration. The week after that, we're going to get the personal view of immigration as we hear from folks that have made Nashville home, who have come from different places. Very diverse group coming from 4 different homelands, 4 different processes, and 4 different stages in that. So looking forward to that. And then the last week, we're going to talk about how we as a community can engage in issues around immigration. So that's our roadmap going forward. We're laying the foundation this week. So when we started, I reached out to Jon Sides and said, hey, who would be a good resource? And Jon said, I know exactly the person, and introduced me to Jon Hiskay. Jon is a professor of political science, and also you teach in the sociology department, is that right?
Yes.
At Vanderbilt. He's been at Vanderbilt for about 20 years. So this is a topic that he has thought about a lot, cares a lot about. So we are really blessed to have him with us. So Jon, thank you for being here today. We look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thanks very much, David. And I'm going to time myself so we can have time for questions and discussions, hopefully when I'm done. Okay, so it's such a pleasure to be here, and I always enjoy talking about these topics with people from all walks of life. I've been focused primarily on immigration from the perspective of origin communities in Latin America. So most of my research has been focused on how immigration, or in this case, emigration, affects origin communities all across Latin America. And but because of that research, I kind of got dragged into focusing on immigration from the U.S. side. Involved in a suit against the Obama administration about 10 years ago for their detention policy of women and children. And so I found myself in the midst of this conversation that has been going on for quite a while. What I'm going to do today is try to give you a brief overview of U.S. immigration policy, but before we really get into it, I want to present to you how many different ways we can think of what immigration policy means, because it's a incredibly complex mosaic of different policies that affect different people in many different ways. We could talk about border security, which is most often the one people think about first. We can talk about visa programs. The number of unauthorized people in the U.S. is, in fact, there are more visa overstayers than people who have crossed without authorization over the borders. So that's a big issue. We can talk about the asylum process. We can talk about refugee resettlement, of which Nashville is a leading city in the resettlement of refugees. We can talk about a topic very relevant today, which is interior enforcement, pathways to citizenship, push factor policies, so Biden's root causes strategy, So the point being, there's lots of different things we could talk about, and I teach a course on immigration politics that lasts 16 weeks, and now I'm being asked to do this in 40 minutes. So with that in mind, my focus today is on our southwest border and kind of how U.S. immigration policy has kind of waxed and waned over the years, and what the implications of that might be for where we find ourselves today. So the roadmap for this talk is, again, a brief immigration policy overview, and then a more focused look on the U.S.-Mexican migration corridor. And then I'll turn to what's happened over the past 25 years, where the profile of immigrants crossing the southwest border has changed dramatically. And I will then look at the U.S. policy responses to these changes, and you note the question mark beside U.S. policy response. The argument will be that we failed to recognize the changes that were happening at the border and the changes in the immigrant profile, and that's in part what has put us here today, and then some closing observations. Okay, so the big picture on U.S. immigration policy. We can really divide or think of immigration policy as a history defined more or less by 5 distinct eras, from the late 1700s through pretty much the 1800s. It was essentially laissez-faire. We didn't really have too many immigration policies on the books, and we were looking to populate parts of the expanding country, and we were looking for labor to build the railroads, et cetera. And essentially, there's nothing much to speak of in terms of immigration policy other than you could come here and establish yourself in this rapidly growing country and economy. We then moved to the late 1800s to the 1920s, where it was can be characterized as selective restriction. And so this is best kind of captured by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Once we had brought in Chinese laborers to help with the construction of railroads and other labor needs in the expanding country, we then got to the point where Congress passed a law that essentially stopped any Chinese immigration from happening moving forward, and prevented those Chinese immigrants that had been here from gaining citizenship, right? We then moved to the 1920s through 1964, where this focus on excluding specific nationalities essentially was expanded to essentially restrict immigration from most parts of the world, but certainly the developing parts of the world, including Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, for that matter. Here, the kind of signature policy was the the 24 Immigration Act, which restricted or set quotas for immigrant numbers from countries based on the 1890 census. And the reason it was based on the 1890 census was that was when the profile of the American population was appealing to those writing this act in 1924. I could say it in another way, but I think you get my drift. So it was set at 2% of what the population numbers were in 1890. And that essentially carried the day throughout the 20th century up until 1965, when we did away with this selective kind of national origin restriction focus, and we expanded it to the Immigration Act of 1965, essentially opened it up to more of a focus. There were quotas put on regions, but the focus turned to skills, the skills that immigrants brought with them, and family reunification. From the mid-'80s until really present day, the dominant policy theme has been prevention through deterrence. That is, we have worked, and this is a very bipartisan approach that has been in place since the Reagan years, but Clinton certainly was part of it. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden all kind of fall under this category of focusing on preventing immigration through deterring people and trying to convince potential immigrants that it's not worth the effort to make the trip across the border. And again, the focus here is primarily on immigration through our southwest border. So here's a chart that gives you the big picture of what immigration and the U.S. foreign-born population looks like. So the bars are the absolute numbers of foreign-born individuals in the U.S. And as you can see, we have a pretty rapid increase in the 80s and 90s. But this is the relative, so this is the percentage of foreign-born as a percentage of the total population. And as you can see, the high point was in the early 1900s. And one could argue that this high point was the kind of one of the reasons for that 1924 legislation that sought to impose more restrictions, right? And so this is kind of a theme that works throughout U.S. immigration policy history, is that it's largely reactive to things that have happened 10, 15 years ago. And here we are in our present day of being at about 13.5% foreign-born population with about 45 million. The most recent estimate was from 2022, and it put it at 46 million. I will say it's very difficult to estimate these numbers with much precision. They're based on American census data, the annual community surveys that the census does. So these numbers, take them as trends and rough estimates of where we are with respect to the foreign-born. Just to give you a sense of where the U.S. fits in the world of developed countries, these are OECD countries, and the gray bar is the percentage of foreign-born in the country's population in 2015. The orange bars are 2005, so it just gives you a sense of where the countries are moving. And as you can see, the U.S. falls right in the middle with about 13.5% in 2015. But you have countries like Switzerland, Australia, New Zealand with significant foreign-born populations. And then on the other side, Italy, Portugal, that are kind of fall on the other side of the U.S. But the takeaway here, for me at least, is that the current situation of foreign-born population in the U.S. is not an extreme when we look at our peer countries, that is OECD countries, in terms of the percentages they have. This is another way to look at what's been happening specifically on the southwest border. These are U.S. border apprehensions from 1925 to 2020. And what you can see here, this is the period where there was not much going on in terms of apprehensions. We have a big spike in the 1950s. This is in part a product of Operation Wetback that was put into, and excuse the term, but that's what it was called, by the Eisenhower administration. Coincidentally, during times that we were providing essentially guest worker, we had a guest worker program in place. I'll get to that in a second. But as you can see, what I want to point out, our high point in current times was 2000, when we reached a peak of, what was it? About 1.7 million. Can you see? Yeah, you can see my cursor. And here, this is 2000. And for the next 20 years, we had a precipitous decline in apprehensions at the southwest border. And I should say that apprehensions at the border have been used by researchers and policymakers as a proxy for the number of people crossing the border, right? It's equivalent in some ways to how we measure the amount of drugs entering our country is by the amount of drugs that we capture, right? And if you consider that our apprehension rate improved dramatically from 2000 to 2021, moving from, this is CBP's own estimates of we were catching about 50% of those crossing the border in 2000 to about 80% in 2020. This decline becomes even more remarkable, right? The takeaway here, there was progress being made in terms of unauthorized border crossings all the way to the point of 2019, where this is the year that we had, or 2018, I'm sorry, where we had the caravans. You may remember hundreds, if not thousands of people gathering together to make the trip up through Mexico and cross the border, right? But the point is that, kind of when I started studying this, we were reaching levels that we hadn't seen since 1970, right? And then the pandemic came and things changed quite a bit. And I'll get to that in a second. So quickly, we need to, when we're thinking about immigration, one thing I think is very important is to understand why people leave, right? And what do we know about who is leaving their country and making that very tough choice to leave their home behind and put their life in peril. Typically, and again, thinking of the migration flows that have come up through Mexico, they have to cross or cartel territory. They have to deal with crossing the border itself. So this is not an easy decision that is made by people. And what we know generally is that the ages of people who make this decision are between 18 to 35. Your chances of immigrating go way down once you pass that kind of 35, 40 mark. They are relatively well educated compared to their neighbors, right? It's an increasingly gender balanced flow that we've been seeing, and I'll get to that in a second. Very important, it is not the poorest of the poor who migrate. They do not have the resources to leave their homes. What we see in study after study is that those who make the decision to go to the U.S. Have a household income that puts them 1, 2, often 3 notches above the poorest of the poor, right? And this is why, so in Mexico, you don't see significant migration flows from southeast Mexico because that tends to be the poorest part of the country. Where you see the highest rates of migration are in some ways the most developed central western part of Mexico. And I'll touch on that in a second. People also choose to migrate for a variety of reasons. It's not all economic migration. There are political reasons, there's security reasons, and we'll get to, that's part of what has changed in the past 20 years. We have a very well-established friends and family effect. So if you have friends or family that have made the trip, it becomes a lot easier for you to make that trip as well because the information costs are lower. You kind of know where you're going to go. You know some routes. So that tends to lead to what's been called a cumulative migration pattern where one town, you have 10 people who migrate, and then that town becomes connected to a certain part of the U.S. Finally, U.S. policy, as I'll talk about, both formal and informal, has proven to be a significant factor in why people decide to migrate. And that may sound intuitive, but we'll look at kind of how that plays out with respect to Mexico. So, turning now to the U.S.-Mexican migration corridor, it's a case of what I call turning the spigot on and trying to turn it off. And when you try to turn it off, you can never make it stop dripping, right? And the U.S. has proven time and time again that they turn it on very easily, When they try to turn it off, the remnants of that period of it being turned on stick around. And this is in part what has put us here today. So quickly, 80 years of US policy, and it's in quotation marks because some of it's not formal policy, but it I think captures what the general mindset of the US was at the time. So 1920s, end of World War I, excuse me. There are increasing restrictions, as we've seen, on Asian immigration and European immigration. There's robust U.S. economic growth in the roaring 20s. There's native-born urbanization taking place in the United States. That is, people are moving at a higher rate from rural areas of the country to the metropolitan areas. All of this leads to a growing need for agricultural labor. And so what was the solution that we came up with? Get on the railroads that go down to Mexico and recruit Mexican labor. So there was active recruitment of Mexican workers in the 1920s that follows very closely the railroad lines that went deep into Mexico. And this is kind of where most of the darker the shade is, the higher the rate of migration households in that area. And this is 1920, so let me show you 2000. Migration from Mexico has largely, since the 1920s, been concentrated in 5 to 6 central western states. And so the notion that Mexican emigration, that is people leaving Mexico, is a nationwide phenomenon is absolutely incorrect. In fact, it only affects about 8 to 10% of the population, and 75%, more or less, in the early 2000s of Mexican immigration came from these dark states, Zacatecas, Jalisco, Michoacan, and a few others. So this is kind of one indication of what recruiting in 1920 may lead to in 2000, right? Going into the 1930s, what is our policy? Well, we're in the midst of a Great Depression, so this is the launch of the Mexican repatriation program, in quotation marks, which led to over 1 million Mexican and American citizens being deported back to Mexico during the Depression. And these signs, Mexicans keep going, can't take care of our own, these were common throughout the Midwest and Southwest. And what's interesting about this is much of this repatriation, quote unquote, was not official policy of the INS, but rather it was a kind of concerted effort from local governments, local businesses, not hiring, local enforcement, putting pressure on those who appeared to be Mexican to leave. So it was, somewhat reminiscent of what we are seeing today. There's a great book out of the University of New Mexico Press called The Decade of Betrayal. So if anybody's interested in reading more about this particular period in our immigration history, I highly recommend that book. Going to the 1940s to the 1960s, let's turn this spigot back on. And we find that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we once again need labor for our fields, for a variety of sectors of the economy. And so there is, once again, an active recruitment, this time in the official vein, by the launch of what is known as the Bracero program. This is a Bracero card or identification that millions of Mexicans were provided to essentially serve as guest workers in the U.S., primarily in the agricultural sector. And interestingly, this Bracero program was almost immediately attempted to be kind of undermined by agricultural interests that, because they did not want to go through the official rules and regulations and bureaucracy of the Bracero program, they were increasingly incentivized to hire undocumented Mexicans. And so we have this curious mix of an official program that allows for legal immigration to take place and serve the U.S. labor needs of the time, also being kind of put alongside this kind of long-running attempt to seek out the cheapest labor possible. And that cheap labor was non-Bracero workers. And so this was kind of part of the motivation behind Eisenhower's Operation Wetback. Even though you had an official worker program, you had increased undocumented and workers coming in, and it's been put forth that Eisenhower's motivation was to kind of try to level out the playing field for those that were hiring Bracero workers by going after undocumented. An interesting side note here is that part of the Bracero program was for the Mexican government to hold 10% of the wages of Braceros, and that was the incentive to get them to return back to Mexico. They would be paid this lump sum upon returning, right? The Mexican government didn't pay them. And so for 30 years, this was kind of challenged in the courts, and ultimately in 2008, there was a ruling in favor of Bracero workers that they would get a lump sum of $3,500 for their efforts during the Bracero years. Unfortunately, they had to provide something like this document, and many of them did not have it at the time, 40 years later. And so, it's kind of a typical story of promises made but not kept. All right, so that was the kind of 40s to the 60s. The spigot was wide open. In the 70s and 80s, it was, we could say, a kind of policy of tacit acceptance of what is known as circular migration, which was kind of the norm for Mexican immigrants to come work in various parts of the U.S. economy and then return and have no plans for permanent residence in the U.S., but rather, work for a few months, maybe a couple years, and then return back home and invest the money they had saved into a business back home. And this was a very widely recognized pattern of migration that was taking place during the 70s and 80s. Not much. There was starting to be talk of border enforcement really ratcheting up in the 70s, but there was not much happening until we get into the mid-80s and 90s. 1990s to the present, we can say this is a period of what Bill Clinton labeled a strategy prevention through deterrence. And so the idea here is pretty intuitive. You make crossing the border or successfully crossing the border as hard as you can make it, and it will deter people from trying. What this strategy is designed to do is make it economically problematic for Mexican immigrants in particular to make that migration calculus, right? To just increase the cost so it's not worth it to them to try to make the trip and work in the U.S. And this is key. It's a strategy clearly focused on stopping Mexican immigrants from coming into the country. The problem is that that's when migration patterns changed. And so let's look at the changing profile of immigrants crossing the U.S. Southwest border from 2000 to really present day. Here you have the U.S. Southwest border apprehensions, and these are people from Mexico. These are people from every other country. So in 2000, 99.2% of individuals that were apprehended at the Southwest border were Mexican-born. This was a clear case of an economic migration corridor where Mexicans were coming to work. They were largely 18 to 35, very much male, So the gender ratio was very much slanted towards men. And it was a relatively kind of predictable migration flow that was taking place, and deterrence was targeted to deter these types of migrants. You see what happens over the course of the next 20 years. In 2014, 2015, this is when we hit the threshold of immigrants crossing the southwest border, those from other countries outnumbering Mexican immigrants. And then we see the spike of the caravans where largely these were individuals from other countries, all right? So we have a completely different kind of look of what the immigrant crossing in 2020 is from what it was in 2000. This is this kind of the same trend line I just showed you. This is broken down percent of total, and so you see it gets up to 80% in the 2018-2019 period. Where were these other countries from? It started out being 90% of those other than Mexico, which was the official category. Other than Mexico, they were from 3 countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I could spend another 50 minutes talking to you about what was happening to lead to that moment. But the civil wars in these countries in the 1980s and the decisions on the part of the U.S. in terms of how to treat what were refugees, essentially treating them as economic migrants. Just as a quick aside, Guatemalans and Salvadorans, their asylum acceptance rate was 3%. Nicaraguans was 88%. All of them were going through the same Civil War dynamics, but in Nicaragua, we opposed the incumbent government, the Sandinistas. And so refugees coming from that country were perceived as legitimate refugees, whereas people coming from El Salvador were seen as, because we were supporting the incumbent government there, they were seen as, they can't be fleeing a bad government because we're supporting that government. And so we treated them as economic migrants. This then, and I'm getting sidetracked, but this is a topic that's very near and dear to me. This then contributed, during the deportation stage, we deported in the early 2000s teenagers who were kids that were brought by their parents from El Salvador and Guatemala during horrific civil wars. Now they were in the US without documentation. And they found themselves in Los Angeles and other big cities where they had to fend for themselves. And these were the origins of MS-13. We then took these gang members who had clearly committed crimes, we put them on a plane and brought them back to San Salvador and left them there in El Salvador to create MS-13 back there. And so that then is the primary cause for what these numbers suggest here, which is a rapid increase in immigrants, not economic immigrants, but people fleeing for their lives from gang-controlled territories in Central America. And so, like I said, this is a very complex story, and there's lots of things going on, but a common denominator oftentimes is kind of U.S. involvement, and don't want to bash the U.S. by any stretch, but there is clear U.S. involvement in episodes that kind of tell this story of immigration. Further evidence of the changing dynamic of immigrants is here in the case of unaccompanied children arriving at the border. We see spikes in all 3 countries where Mexico is remaining flat. Family units have a big spike in the teens, both under Obama and Trump. Single adult, this is Mexico and these are the other countries. So it was a case of just a fundamentally different type of person that was flooding the border. Obama called it a humanitarian crisis, but his administration pursued a policy of detaining women and children. And that's what I was involved with in terms of the ACLU lawsuit against them. which was successful because you're not allowed to detain a category of people. You can detain individuals based on individual reasons, and this was the court ruling today. Who knows what's being followed. Okay, so this is the post-2019 data, the kind of post-COVID data, and this is where my expertise starts to trail off, because this is where we see those other countries becoming countries other than the three I mentioned. So now we get Venezuelans, we get Haitians, we get people from Ethiopia, and part of it is, again, related to the kind of two-step migration process, where Brazil was a major recruiter of immigrant labor for the 2016 Olympics and the World Cup. And once that period ended, they had all of this immigrant labor that they had recruited with nothing for them to do. So they started kicking them out, and they take the decision to go to the US, right? And so this is part of how all of these things connect in one way or another, and oftentimes it is the destination country actively recruiting and then reaching a period where they don't need them anymore, okay? All right, so how am I doing? Ooh, I got 1 minute. It was 35 minutes, so I can go a little longer. So this is the U.S. policy response to these changes I've just described. Basically, there was no response other than build up the border security, right? So what migration scholars call what's been happening on the U.S. southwest border is a mixed migration flow, where it's not 2000 where you have all Mexican people coming to work. Now you have kids, women, teenagers that are running for their lives because they've been threatened by a gang, all sorts of reasons that people are deciding to make that move. And it's no longer a question of deterrence actually working for that subset of immigrants. We have an article out called "Leaving the Devil You Know," and it basically captures the decision calculus that many were making during this time, which is simply, I'm going to get killed. There goes my timer. I'm going to get killed if I stay here. I know it's going to be incredibly difficult to make it to the US, but I'm going to take my kid and give it a chance because I know somebody who made it, even though I might know 8 people who didn't, but it's better than what I have facing me tomorrow, right? And there's just horrific stories of what was going on in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala in terms of the 2010 to 2020 period, in terms of how outrageous gang control had become in these countries. Here, I want to highlight just a few of the key legal statutes that I believe are still on the books, as far as I know. One is our asylum code that came from the 1980 Refugee Act, in which the wording is that any alien, non-citizen who is physically present in the U.S. or arrives in the U.S., irrespective of such alien status, may apply for asylum. Okay, so this has been on the books. This has been a clear-cut piece of our legislative history that anybody with their feet on U.S. soil can apply for asylum, right? And now, in the past 15 years on the southwest border, instead of having tens of thousands of Mexican economic migrants arriving, you have tens of thousands of women and children and others who are using this asylum provision in our law in a legal way to apply for asylum, all right? You have the Flores versus Reno settlement in '97 that essentially was in some ways anticipating what was to come in terms of how treatment of minors was going to take place And essentially it said, foundational principles, critical protections regarding the care, custody, and release of immigrant children who are in federal custody. And then when this was tried to be violated, both by the Obama administration and by the Trump administration, granted to varying degrees, the courts ruled against them each and every time. That this ruling in 2019 says the Forest Agreement is a binding contract and consent decree. It is a creature of the parties' own contractual agreements. Defendants cannot simply ignore the dictates of the consent decree merely because they no longer agree with it, right? Which is what is essentially happening. A breaking of their own laws. So when you hear about lawbreakers, you have to ask yourself, who is breaking the law more? The people crossing the border or the people enforcing the border? But so this is what has been kind of hanging over this changing immigration dynamic for the past 20 years. And just very quickly, deterrence through the years, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, all focused on deportations. Bush, Obama, Trump, border security. There was the Secure Fence Act under Bush. Obama beefed up the border security. So this is not a partisan issue in terms of the approach that various administrations have taken to trying to stop southwest border immigration. It has been consistent for the past 30 years. Obama and Trump, they wanted to partner with Mexico. Also, Obama and Trump, they both launched public relations campaigns in Central America. This is a billboard that was paid for by the US government that was in El Salvador, where it says, I thought it would be easy for my son to obtain papers in the north. It wasn't so. And, there were songs that were written, there were radio commercials, all to try to deter people from sending or from leaving their homes. I don't know if I have time for this, but detention. So detention has been the big one. And just very quickly, 2019 average number of detainees for border crossing was about 45,000. Just quickly, the cost, $134 a day to detain a single person, $19 a day to detain a family unit. Average cost of an alternative to detention program is about $6 a day. And this is call-ins, ankle bracelets, various other approaches that have been tried. The immigration court appearance rate for non-detained individuals in ATD programs is between 92 and 96%. So they work. Except they don't work as well as detention, because detention, you have 100% appearance rate. So the question is, do we want to invest all of this money that we're investing in detention for that 5%, that difference between the 100% appearance rate you get with detainees versus the 93% that you get with alternative to detention programs? Individual court appearance rate for individuals with legal representation is about 96%, right? And again, I should say, these are based on 2015 to 2019 data analyses, so this could have changed, not sure. Also, worth to note, since we're in Nashville, that the two main detention bed providers in the country are Core Civic, housed right here in Nashville, main offices in Green Hills, and the Geo Group. Core Civic stock has increased 189% since 2020. I'll let you make of that what you will. The Executive Office for Immigration Review is the immigration court system that we have here. And the pending cases as of 2023 were 2.9 million. So these are individuals waiting for their day in court that are here legally in the sense of they have a pending trial, right? And they're following the rules that have been laid out for them. And the immigration court system is failing them. Average days to final adjudication, 762. Immigration court judges, 682. And that's an increase from the 350 it was under Obama. I've been banging the drum for heavy investment in the immigration court system for 10 years. And what's happening currently is judges are leaving the system. I think the numbers have been going down steadily over the past 8 months. Comparison of budgets, CBP, ICE, and EOIR, and again, these are very dated. I would imagine the trends have continued the same, if not sharply increased. This is, what is this? CBP, this is ICE in billions, and this is the EOIR, the Immigration Court System, 420 million, right? So I finally made it to closing observation. Basically, we have a long history of turning on and off this spigot. And represents, to me at least, a failure to come to terms with U.S. demand for immigration and how we're going to deal with that demand. There is a demographic certainty here that my demographer friends will insist on, which is we need immigrants in our country. The U.S. fertility rate in 2024 is 1.6 kids, far below the population replacement level of 2.1. As an aside, Mexico's fertility rate in 1970 was 7.1. It is down to 1.9. And so Mexican immigration as a problem, or problem, quote unquote, as an issue, is essentially going to be a thing of the past in the next 5-10 years. Their population bubble has long gone through our system. They are now in a situation where they're recruiting immigrant labor in certain cases. We have a fundamental shift in immigration patterns over the past 20 years that we have not come to terms with. And this is, I think, at the root of what we're seeing today, because the failings of Congress to really grapple with this change has led to an enormous amount of presidential executive discretion with what to do with immigration, right? And we've seen it under Bush, we've seen it under Obama, and we've seen it under Trump now twice, that this kind of area of discretion has just been waiting for something like what we're seeing today to be put into effect. And it's, again, the failure to come to terms. Policy options, the funding for executive office, the immigration court system, maybe a root causes approach, but that's kind of politically difficult to sell that it's going to help in 10 years. I think that was part of the problem Biden ran into. Regional strategy for refugees, with what's going on in Venezuela, it remains to be seen whether that's going to produce more refugees if things get messy there. Expansion of H-2A and H-2B programs, that's proven effective for reducing the number of Mexican immigrants and addressing the supply and demand side that has always been here. And kind of that's the thing that has remained the same throughout this entire period. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you. I don't know if we have time for questions, but
We've got time for one or two.
okay. Yep. Yeah.
You used the metric about apprehension. I think in 2021 was like 80%. I think that's a good metric. Like you look at Clinton, Bush, Obama, even Trump. But their policies were to detain those people, screen them, and deport them.
Yes.
Biden, who you didn't really mention, he had a catch and release program. So how did that skew your numbers at all?
So, yeah, that's a great question. One thing I forgot to mention, so in March of 2020, the CBP and DHS decided to change the numbers that they were providing to the public. So this really messed with a lot of researchers that had been relying on this apprehension data. From 2020 onward, it is now referred to as encounter data. And that includes people that are not apprehended crossing between ports of entry, but rather also those people that are turned away at ports of entry, and those that were under Title 42 that were during COVID and under Biden, he was also employing Title 42 of expedited removal. So point being that the apprehension numbers really kind of spike after 2020, and we don't really know how to kind of unpack whether those spikes are in part a function of the change in data reporting, including people at ports of entry. To your question of, so whether or not they are caught and released, which is essentially a term I think refers to alternative to detention programs, right? You don't just catch and release unless they are in the system, and they have a legitimate case moving forward, right? So all of the people being bused to New York or Chicago or wherever, they were all in the system in a sense of having some claim that did not result in their immediate removal.
But many of them were criminals.
I don't know that.
The people that were released 5 times, he raped and murdered a number of people. If they had been deported
Right.
or detained,
Yeah.
other people wouldn't have been killed.
Yeah. So, looking at it from a big picture perspective, I mean, there's always going to be, I think, cases of individuals doing reprehensible things. But in terms of trying to understand the impact of the immigration policy in general, what those apprehension numbers suggest is, I think, would support my contention that we're not successfully dealing with this new type of immigrant that are making legitimate legal claims for asylum, or humanitarian parole, or temporary protected status. There are a lot of kind of very clear legislative mandates on the books that these individuals were coming in under, and that's in part what Biden was doing kind of more than others, which was finding ways to provide humanitarian parole and temporary protected status. And again, I think that speaks to the failings of Congress to have a very clear legislative response to the changes that have taken place. And it was Biden's decision to come up with a CBP-1 program to kind of try to get a handle on this, but it's a failing on both sides of the aisle in terms of having individuals that are pending legal adjudication be here in the country, oftentimes without work status or work authorization, which kind of makes the problem even worse. So yeah, it's a difficult issue.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend in terms of resources if we want to learn a lot more about this? Can we audit your class, please?
You are more than welcome to come to my class. Let's see. So Doug Massey is a researcher. He's a sociologist at Princeton, and I think he's kind of my mentor on migration research. Massey, M-A-S-S-E-Y. And I would recommend any of the works that he's done recently. He kind of wrote the 1990s and early 2000s textbook, but since then he has been kind of viewed as one of the premier voices in making sense of all of this. Yeah. Okay.
John, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. So we will reconvene next week. Heather Doherty is going to be leading us in a conversation around the theological biblical perspective